finding myself at a loss for words. And the funny thing is, it's okay. The last thing I need is to be heard, but to hear what you would say. Word of God, speak. Would you pour down like rain, washing my eyes to see your majesty, to be still and know that you're in this place. Please let me stay and rest.
Here to praise God. The text that was read for Scripture is one of my favorite, and we will bring it out here in a little bit. But before we begin, let's pray. Dear Lord, I ask that your Spirit will be here with me, with everyone, that we may grow towards your kingdom as we think about how you have led and guided in the past and apply it to our hearts now. In your name, amen. There's a story about two brothers back in the 1800s out west in a town that was growing, and they had money, but they were scoundrels. Henry and Scott caused all kinds of grief in the town, and one reason or another, people, they had to work around them. There was nothing they could do. So anyway, finally Henry died, and so Scott went to the local minister and he said, look, I know you know who we are, but I'll make it worth your while if you will say a good word about my brother at his funeral. And the pastor said, come back tomorrow and I'll give you an answer. And so Scott came back the next day, and the minister said, yeah, I'll do it. And so they were having the funeral for Henry, and the pastor was saying the normal things, and then he said, you know these people and their lives. He said, but Henry, compared to his brother Scott, was a saint. Daring, and he managed to say a good word about Henry, sort of. It was a comparative, obviously. But when you think about it, today we're going to be talking about courage. And often I have done a World War II story, but I felt like I do have one, but most of those don't fit the definition of courage that we're talking about. When you look up in Webster's New World Dictionary, Elementary Edition, 1966, courage, being able to control one's fear and so to face danger, pain, or trouble willingly. Bravery. The New Lexicon Webster's Dictionary of the English Language, a great big thick thing, 1988 edition says, courage, it's very similar. Courage, the capacity to meet danger without fear, without giving way to fear, to have the courage of one's conviction, to be willing to put one's opinions into practice. The Oxford Dictionary says the ability to do something that frightens one. All right? And then it gives a whole series of synonyms: bravery, braveness, courageousness, pluck, pluckiness, valor, fearlessness, intrepidity, intrepidness, nerve, daring, audacity, boldness, and it goes on with others. Merriam-Webster definition: mental or moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. I like that one. Have you ever watched Courage in Action? I mean, seen it in real life. Or maybe you were having to carry it out at some point. And you knew you had to do something that was right, but you were sure that it was going to cost you dearly. Maybe you felt that catch in your throat, or felt the shake of your voice no matter how hard you tried to control it. Or maybe your hands were shaking when you were holding the paper because you knew that this was an important moment that you were dealing with. The funny thing is, several times when I felt like I had to do something that had to be done, I found that I was not able to predict what the results would be. The things that I didn't think would cost me did. And the things that I had thought would cost me didn't. So it seems to me apparent that when we act those times of courage, we never know what the ultimate result will be. And I'm sure at some point in your life, all of us are older, and the younger ones will soon experience it as they go on, that we have to demonstrate courage and do something that we are very concerned probably will impact our lives significantly. As we go on in time, there is no question that there will come a point somewhere where that will become critical. Courage is the daunting ability to look the consequences in the face and still go forward with what you know is right. And there are some famous books. The Red Badge of Courage, Stephen Crane's book about a young recruit in the Civil War who runs from a battle and runs from the front. He's terrified. And after he's gone through and dealt with the shame of running and listening to people, other people who also had run, he goes back and he is able to be on the front lines and face what is deadly rifle fire. Another famous book about people that are courageous, Profiles in Courage by JFK, goes and deals with 9 different senators who he felt exhibited unusual courage. And I'm going to mention a couple of them. Just maybe you've heard of Sam Houston. Unusual man. He was elected governor of 2 different states within just a few years of each other. He was governor of Tennessee, and then later in his life he became governor of Texas. When he came into the room, you couldn't have missed him. He was 6'6", which is giant in his day and age. Huge guy. And he was president also of Texas when it was an independent nation. Maybe you didn't realize that, but for 9 years, Texas was a completely separate country from the United States. He was president of it at that time. And he went on to become one of the first senators from Texas. And he got the ire of Texans after repeatedly countering and arguing against the states' rights ideas of John Calhoun, who was the senator from South Carolina. And eventually Texans decided that he shouldn't be senator anymore and wouldn't elect him the next time. He ran for governor of Texas and was defeated the first time. And then he won the second time. And this is just before the Civil War. In 1861, he was removed from governorship by the Texas legislature because he refused to swear allegiance to the Confederate States of America. And then the Texas legislature went on and voted to secede from the Union after they removed him from governor. Little piece of courage. Another senator, this one you probably have never heard of, but he did something that was, historians now understand, was very significant. It was during the administration of Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's vice president, after Lincoln was assassinated. It was 1868, and Andrew Johnson was being impeached because he wanted to fire Edwin Stanton, who was his Secretary of War. We now call him the Secretary of Defense. And the radical Republicans in Congress were out to punish the South. And Edmund Ross was a part of those radical Republicans. But as he got to thinking about what was happening and how they were impeaching Andrew Johnson and what it would do to the presidency, he decided that he could not go along with what everyone else was doing. And his single lonely vote was the vote that kept Andrew Johnson in office and saved American presidency from falling apart to totally partisan politics. I realize you may listen to the news today and you may wonder what's gone awry, but if it had happened way back then, believe me, it would have been a lot worse now. So those are just a few examples of courage, and those only cost these men their political careers and their livelihood if they were depending on that. In the book, 1,000 Shall Fall, about Frank Hazel and his family in Nazi Germany, there are several stories of very raw courage in that book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do. And before I mention the story, if you've ever heard of Lawrence Kohlberg, he's the man from Harvard who came up with the hierarchy of moral adeptness or moral qualities. And he gave a list of hierarchy of different moral learning. And the final one was principled morality. But when I went to school, some of my professors actually gave the exact example, and they didn't know it at the time, that was going to be written in this book, in 1,000 Shall Fall. You have Helene Hazel, the mother, living in Frankfurt, and she has a Jewish boy in her house, and 3 Gestapo officers come to the door, knock loudly, and they say, are you hiding Jews? And of course, in class, we were told, oh, you can't say anything. You got to decide whether you're going to give up the Jew or whether you're not going to give up the Jew. I think there are more opportunities than that, and Helene exhibited it perfectly. When they knock on the door, she says, you can come in and look for yourselves. And they look at one another, and then they ask her again, are you hiding Jews? And she said, come on in, you can look for yourselves. They refused. They ask a third time, are you hiding Jews? And she says, as I've said, come on in, you can look for yourselves. They looked at one another in disgust and walked away. And a 10-year-old Jewish boy was hiding under the tablecloth in the house. And it gives you the idea of courage. She knew what it would cost if she had been found out, and what it would have cost her children, because it was unmerciful, the kinds of things that were happening. Ideas of courage. But today I want to look at a Bible hero who risked his life to show, and he didn't do it to show what courage is, he did it because of who he believed in. And it seems far above the usual stories of human courage, because without debate or argument or resistance, he was willing to die over the simple idea of worship. And we have been duly warned that somewhere down the road, that is going to be the exact issue that we face in our lives, we think, at some point here in the near future. We will follow either human ideas and seemingly keep the ability to buy and sell while preserving our lives, or we will unhesitatingly choose loss of everything, including possibly our lives, to worship God as he has outlined that worship to be done. So to set the stage for today's well-known Bible character, we have to look back in time into the Old Testament, past Malachi, past Zechariah, past Haggai, and back before Esther. And we're going back to the date of 538 BC. And you may, just to give a little picture going the other way from well back in before Christ, in 605, Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, and he had conquered it just after Egypt had conquered Jerusalem and taken Josiah's son captive. And Nebuchadnezzar conquers it, and at that time he takes a number of people to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar conquered it again in 597 BC because Judah had rebelled against him. And he takes Zedekiah, the new guy that he's putting on the throne, and he makes him swear by the God of Israel, Jehovah, that he will stay faithful to Nebuchadnezzar as a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar. And you know the story. He does not. He and Judah rebel. And this time, when Nebuchadnezzar comes the third time to Jerusalem, what do you think he does? He levels the place and burns it, just as God had said would be happening. The untrustworthiness of the Jews in Judah at the time of Nebuchadnezzar's third siege of Jerusalem was such that they were compared to rotten figs, so bad they could not be eaten. Ezekiel sees God's presence leaving the temple, and the word from heaven is that there is not one true worshiper in Jerusalem save possibly Jeremiah and one or two of his associates. So the land lies desolate for 70 years. The once center of wealth and wisdom in the Near East under Solomon lies in ruins and desolation. God is just. And when his people turn away from him and become just like the rest of the world, he is just and brings judgment on them, just as he did on the Canaanites when Israel had conquered the land 850 years earlier in around 1400 BC. So when Nebuchadnezzar takes these young people, or takes a number of the artisans and the nobility to Babylon, among them, and you don't often hear their Jewish names, you usually know them by their Babylonian names, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, and Daniel. And these four young men in their late teens would represent the God of Israel more completely than the whole population in Judah at the time. They would set Nebuchadnezzar's standard of what trustworthiness was. Remember, at the beginning, Daniel chapter 1, they choose not to eat the king's food. And of course, the man in charge of them says, it's going to cost me my head if the king sees you looking gaunt and thin. And they said, do this. Just test us for 10 days. Give us vegetables to eat and see if we will not seem wiser and healthier. And after 10 days, God had blessed them. That starts a whole train of events that shakes and moves the kings of empires, because somebody is willing to dare to do what God has asked them to do. Their careful choices about food and drink, God could use them to stand out. Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar has his dream of the image with the head of gold and the arms and chest of silver and the thighs. And if you remember, Daniel ends up interpreting the dream and says, this is not possible. The God of heaven has given this vision to you. And as I've always wondered, why would Nebuchadnezzar, in the second year of his reign, want to know what was going to happen? Well, he was 62 at the time of his second year of his reign. And sometimes people in their 60s begin to think ahead about what's coming and how things will go. And then and of course, Nebuchadnezzar later in his life builds an image of gold symbolically stating that looks just like the one he saw in the dream, except it's all of gold. The idea, the symbolism is, my kingdom is going to last forever. And notice that it took somebody completely dedicated to God to turn a king's show of power and authority on its head. God needed some people who were not afraid to die for their beliefs. And when you read about Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, or Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah, these men had no qualms about what they were facing. If you read how they answered the king, we are not going to answer you very carefully, king, here, because we will not serve your gods. And they knew what it was going to cost. And then sometime in the 570s, Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream of the great tree that's cut. And again, God uses Daniel to tell him the meaning of the dream. And the whole idea behind this is God has given Nebuchadnezzar a picture of down the future, way ahead. Now God is putting his finger on Nebuchadnezzar and says, I'm also the personal God. I can tell you what is going to happen to you if you do not change and humble yourself. And, of course, that comes true. And amazingly, Nebuchadnezzar goes insane for the 7 years, and incredibly, he is put back on the throne when God gives him his reason back. And he dies in about 562 BC at 104 years old, which is astounding. And then there are a number of kings of Babylon between 562 and 539. And in Daniel chapter 5, I'm just going down through the chapters, you have the old statesman. And he's somewhere probably between the age of Marvin and Howard. He's in his mid-upper 80s, approximately. And he may have been removed from doing duties for King Belshazzar at the time. We have no record. It seems like he's not in any major capacity, but he's called in to read the writing on the wall, and he's made the third ruler in the kingdom the night that Belshazzar is killed when Cyrus conquers Babylon. And then this sets the stage for Daniel 6, which is what we're going to talk about today, and gives a glimpse of what is coming in the future to us as Seventh-day Adventists and to other Christians who choose to worship God as he is asked. If you'll open your Bibles to Daniel 6 and verse 1, we're going to be reading today down through Daniel 6. And I'm going to ask for volunteers to read different sections of it. And is there someone that would be willing to read Daniel 6, 1 to 3? Yes, Bob, go ahead.
It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king thought to set him over the whole realm.
Notice the incredible respect that Darius has for Daniel in considering and putting him second in power. Now, I just want to give you a little picture of how unusual this would be. What if Vladimir Putin's second or third in command took over Mike Pence's spot as vice president? Would you be shocked? I imagine most of us would be a little stunned. Here you have a king coming in, conquering, and he's going to take one of the workers of the previous administration and make him number 2 in his kingdom. This doesn't happen very often in worldly affairs. And it takes somehow an unusual kind of character that somebody who was the enemy of the kingdom that you were working for wants you to serve way up in his administration. You just don't find that very often. Some rather pure speculation, it is possible that Darius may have known Daniel from his work previously in years past when Daniel traveled around as an ambassador under Nebuchadnezzar and possibly under some of the following kings after Nebuchadnezzar. And when you read in Daniel 8, it mentions the vision. People are not clear if he's seen Shushan in vision and didn't actually go there, or if he'd actually been there. If he had been there, then it's quite likely as an ambassador he had connected with some of these people many, many years earlier, and they knew about him. And, of course, the nuances of wise use of authority to keep the lower government officials functioning for the one in authority is an art. Disgruntled officials were always a conspiracy concern and an assassination threat, no less in those days than today in many places in the world. So Darius is taking a massive risk in putting a non-Mede and a non-Persian in second in command. And the replaced Medo-Persian government officials are outraged that Darius would put a Jewish eunuch exile as the head of all the governors of the realm. And envy and jealousy are deadly and usually bear ferocious fruit. This time is no exception. Would somebody read Daniel 4 and 5, verses 4 and 5? Yes, go ahead, Therese.
So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could not find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, We shall not find any fault against Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God.
I have to think, could an enemy of mine say such a thing about me? So pretty.
One,
Pardon?
there is one that says it against the enemy of God who says so.
Yes. But that they can't find anything wrong with me except how I worship my God, or how I'm worshiping my God versus the gods that everyone else is worshiping. It's an astounding idea of character. Here he is, a captive exile, and he's worshiping his God completely in this foreign land and standing for what he believes. And remember how I pointed out that the Jews that were left in Judah after the first and second time that Nebuchadnezzar had conquered Jerusalem were considered very ugly examples of the followers of God. And notice what Ezekiel says, and I'm just going to paraphrase it because we're going to run out of time. Ezekiel talks about how even if Noah, Daniel, and Job were in the land of Judah, he would still send a famine, and they would only deliver their own lives because of their righteousness. And then he goes on to talk about beasts, and then he goes on to talk about sword, and then he goes on to talk about pestilence to Ezekiel. And he says, now, how many do you think will be left if I send all four of these consecutively against the people of Judah, because they are so rebellious against my name? And Ezekiel says, well, there can't be anybody left. And God says, I will save a remnant. But even if Noah, Job, and Daniel were there, the unrighteousness of Judah compared to how these four young men totally represent God correctly in a foreign land is amazing. When we dedicate ourselves to God, he can bring about astounding results. And that's where our text comes in today. And again, it's said to King Asa, and the second part of it is a rebuke to King Asa because he refused to believe God and did something foolish. But the first part of it states how God is looking for us, looking for you and I to represent him. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong in behalf of them whose heart is perfect toward him. Herein, and then it describes how Asa had done foolishly. God wants to work in your life and mine, showing his power through us, but he can only do it for us if our hearts are perfect toward him. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah kept their hearts perfect towards God, and God used them to make men stand in awe of their God. God is the same today. He can and will do that for those whose hearts are perfect towards him. So how does one acquire this perfect heart? It's nearly the same as what I must do to be saved at the beginning, but with a long-term view of consistent obedience thrown in. How can I, a born sinner with all my own thoughts, ideas, desires, and opinions tainted with sin, ever have a heart that is perfect toward God? It is the great question. It is the one that all of us have to answer if we are here honestly, with honest hearts, to worship God. And here are a few texts that outline and give a picture of how we can have a perfect heart. And the first one is in 2 Corinthians 10, 2-5. I'll just read it quickly. For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.
Amen.
That gives you the quick snapshot of how we get perfect hearts. And that text shows where the battlefield is. It's right here between my ears. My guess is it may be there for you too. And it's the most rigorous fight of my life, and it's probably the most rigorous fight of your life, to submit and bring every thought into the captivity of obedience to Jesus Christ. And when I do that, it will feel most likely like plucking out my eye or cutting off my right hand, because it goes directly against my wishes and desires. And the reason is the war against my sinful nature. Jesus has won that war. And when I claim his name and follow his law, he will conquer and win in my life too. Another text that I've found very helpful. Psalms 139, 24 and 25. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. When you pray this prayer, God doesn't leave it unanswered. He will show you, and he will show me when I pray that prayer what I need to give to him. Then, while we're continuing the fight of choosing to bring everything in our hearts into obedience to Jesus, we can remember Philippians 1:6. And it says this, being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Christ. In other words, as long as I keep submitted to him, he will do that work in me that I can't do. And the last one, and these are just a few, these are just 4 of the many texts in the Bible that can guide in that process of having a perfect heart. Psalms 19, the last verse, I think it's 23. Psalms 19:14, I'm sorry. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. These just give a very brief outline of what it's like to choose to let Jesus into every corner and closet of my thought life, because that's where the battle is won and lost, right here. He can then root out the evil, but I have to choose him every moment of every day. So now the stage is set. Darius is wishing to promote Daniel, and the other government officials underneath him do not want that to happen. And you know the story well, but we're going to just go through it. And if somebody would be willing to read Daniel 6, verses 6 to 9. Go ahead.
Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king, and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, and the counselors and the captains, have consulted together to establish a royal statute, and to make a firm decree, that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, say thee, O king, he should be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree, and sign and write it, that it be not changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree.
Throughout history, many all-powerful leaders have declared themselves gods. This was uncommon among the Persians, but not so much is known about the Medes, and Darius was a Mede. It is known that when the Persians conquered Egypt, they allowed the Persian king, I think it was Cyrus or Cambyses, to be called a god, because all of the Egyptians were used to the idea of Pharaoh being a god. So when the Persian king conquered them, they allowed him to be called a god. But we don't know exactly how this worked with Darius being a Mede. But in any event, think about it. If you were the king and you just conquered a new area, 21 days is often the idea of setting a new habit. So if you have the people not worship any of the Babylonian gods for 30 days and have to give allegiance to your government, it's going to start a habit train that should help them cooperate with you. What could go wrong with the law? So much it seemed, you know? And not only that, but it's only for 30 days, so it's going to expire, because the king of the Medes and the Persians had to be careful, very careful, what he signed, because he could not change it for any reason. It could not be changed. So he had to think out long-term what the ramifications are of this. And it should have caused him to take some careful thought. But he said, yeah, from a worldly point of view, it makes a lot of sense. And so he goes ahead and signs it. It also is important for us to think about what we say and how we go about what we sign and how we live. Because it's a law of the mind. What we put our focus on, what we intentionally put in front of our eyes for entertainment, or what we take pride in, all of these shape and dramatically impact our characters and thereby impact our destiny. It's an automatic law. You cannot get away from it. By beholding, we are changed. It's something that we do, monkey see, monkey do, as kids will sometimes say. If someone will now read verse 10. Go ahead, Mary.
Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. And in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days.
Notice, there is a meaning of courage. The only meaning of courage that I know better than that is Jesus willing to come and be born as a human being to save me. That's the only definition that would be higher. This man, Daniel, knows the man now somewhere at the age of in the middle 80s. He knows that his life might end at the end of today. He's praying there and he knows it's the day that you are found guilty of this, you go to the lion's den. And he knows that that's probably that there are people watching. And they're probably watching from multiple angles because they've staked out his house. But he didn't contemplate doing anything else. If somebody will read verse 12. Yes, Catherine.
Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days save of thee, O king, shall be cast in the den of lions? The king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not.
Here the accusers ask the king the rhetorical question. Everyone knows what the king is going to have to say. The mouse's teeth are on the cheese. And now the accusers are ready to spring the trap and inevitably trap Darius with his own law. Verse 13 and 14, would somebody read those?
Then answered they and stood before the king, That Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him.
Darius now saw how by appealing to his vanity and pride, he'd been tricked into signing a law that was specifically formulated to take out one person in his kingdom. And now the king was powerless to stop the march of events. Darius, it says, was sore displeased with himself and tried everything he could think of, but it was no use. Verse 15 shows the determined nature of the plotters. They are there to, quote, help the dismayed and distraught monarch carry out the law that he had signed. If someone will read verse 15 and 15, let's see, 15. Yeah, just 15 for now.
Then these men approached the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed.
The accusers are not about to let the king, by some little-known legal maneuver, are quibbling over the definition of the word is, or using Robert's Rules of Order to keep Daniel out of the mouths of hungry lions. The king is bound by the law, and the penalty must be paid. It is the same way with me. I have an accuser. I have broken the law. The penalty must be paid, and it appears that I must die for breaking that law. Before having Daniel lowered into the lion's den, Darius says more to give hope, likely to himself, than any other intent. And I would like somebody to read 16 and 17.
So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Then a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed.
Notice, and then a stone was rolled over the entrance to the den, and the king sealed it with his rings and the rings of his lords. This had a twofold intent, that the sentence is duly carried out, and second, that no one can break that seal to do good or harm to the one in the den without incurring the judgment of the king. Obviously, they're assuming that harm is going to be done by the lions, but nobody can go near there in case Daniel survives to hurt him or to do him good by trying to get him out. That's why it was sealed. Verse 18, yes.
Jesus also had the stone rolled and sealed. So Daniel did not suffer anything that Jesus did not suffer.
Yes, and we'll get to that in just a minute. Exactly. Verses 18 and 19. Somebody read it.
Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions.
Have you ever spent waking up in the night thinking of something you said and wishing you hadn't said it? I wouldn't be surprised. I know I have. And you're in there going, groaning of embarrassment. Why did I say that? Why? And here Darius is thinking about it. And the word music can mean any entertainment of any sort. And instead, the king fasted and was awake all night. You have to wonder, how many times did he look out the window watching for any sign of the faint glow of light coming from the east? How many times did he consult the timekeeping devices of that age? He couldn't look at his watch. He had to look at something else, whatever they used at that time. Just as soon as it is legally possible to check on the condemned, Darius is there, having the seal broken and the stone rolled out of the way. There is another time that a stone was rolled out of the way, as Mary mentioned. But unlike this story, there was one dead behind that stone. But the stone was rolled away, and it changed the sentence that I was doomed to serve, death forever. And then that child that was born to us, the son that was given, who was dead but came to life and arose and stepped forward past the rock and out of the craggy cavern, to have the government put on his shoulder, whose name is called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace, steps out, and he's paid the price for me.
Amen.
And verse 20, if somebody would read that.
And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions?
Can you hear that question hanging on the morning air? And notice that lamentable voice. He doesn't dare believe that it could be true. How can you spend a whole night in with a whole bunch of hungry lions and survive? It's never heard of before. Now, the question is he able? Is the God able to deliver? I want to give you a couple verses that answer that from the New Testament. Now, unto him that is able to keep you from falling and to present you faultless before the presence of his glory with exceeding joy. It's Jude 23 and 24. He is able. The God we serve is able to do that. Verse 22. Somebody would read that.
My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocence was found in me, also before thee, O King
And keep going, verse 23.
Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God.
You can imagine the incredibleness of that moment when they pull Daniel up and there's not a scratch on him. Maybe there were some cat hairs, but there was no scratch. Then something happens which really hits us hard in the 21st century. And it says in 624, and I'll read it. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, their wives, and the lions had mastery over them, and brake all their bones in pieces ever they came near the bottom of the den. There would be no peace in the kingdom if the accusers were left alive. And while it seems overbearing to our culture in the shame and honor society of back then, any living relative could take revenge on Daniel or on the king for the execution of another relative. The only way to assure peace was to clear the deck of any potential threat. Just check out Middle Eastern culture even of today. You don't have to look very far to see what a shame honor society and how they go about doing justice. It's brutal. However, at the end of time, the great accuser, that person in God's universe who has accused me before God, and I am guilty, along with his massive number of allies, will also be wiped out to be no more. It will put an end to the insidious nature of sin. It will wipe it out, branch and root. But Darius was not about to let this thing which had happened in the capital pass without his whole realm knowing the story. If somebody will read verses 25 to 27.
Then King Darius wrote, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lion?
Notice how this monarch describes this God who has rescued his favorite advisor from certain death. Men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. Why? He is the living God, which must mean that many or all other gods are not living or dead. Steadfast forever, faithful, will always carry out what he has promised. His kingdom will not be destroyed. All other kingdoms come to an end. His dominion will be even to the end. Read it as if it keeps on going even when the end comes. This God delivers, he rescues, he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and earth. Do you think that Darius heard the story of the fiery furnace after this? Do you think that he heard about the sundial going back in Hezekiah's day? Do you think he heard about Joshua commanding the sun to stand still? Notice he mentions wonders in the heavens. All right? Do you suppose he heard about the manna and the water for 40 years in the wilderness, the Red Sea and the plagues on Egypt? Daniel was able to tell the story of salvation to this king and influence him. But it didn't stop there, because if you read early on in Daniel, it says, and he prospered into the kingdom of Cyrus, the Persian. Not only did Daniel deal with Darius, but he was able to tell Cyrus about Isaiah 45. And just to paraphrase, because we're short on time, Isaiah 45 talks about how God is going to open the double bronze doors. Babylon had double bronze doors. He's going to open those doors for Cyrus. These words are written by Isaiah over 100 years before Cyrus is even born. And he promises that he will subdue nations before Cyrus, and that he's asking that Cyrus will let his people go back home. So the influence of this one example by somebody who was willing to die for what he believed goes down through and influences Cyrus to write the decree to allow the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. What do you think about that influence? What do you think about just one person whose heart is perfect towards God? And I would assume that he had talked with Cyrus about all these other events that he had told Darius, because Darius by this time had died. That is our call today. This is what God wants from us today, so that God can show himself strong in behalf of us whose hearts are perfect toward him. So here we are in Earth's last stage of history. Revelation is quite clear. It will come down to worshiping a human being claiming to be God and receiving a mark, or worshiping the God of heaven who made the earth, the seas, and the springs of water. We, each one, will have the choice to open our windows and continue to worship as we did aforetime, or capitulate to the forceful measures of the beast and just to be able to buy and sell at the end of time. Will I be willing to disregard the loss of property or the possible loss of my life to worship God as he has asked on his holy day? How many of you wish to worship only God? Is that something you wish to ask God for help to do? Shall we pray? Dear Lord, we come before you, needing your power in our hearts. We can't save ourselves. Only you can save us. We pray by the power of your name that we will commit to you, and that we will realize that it takes the willingness of people who are willing to die for what they believe to turn the world on its head. And we ask that you'll give us that kind of courage to represent you before everyone we meet every day.
I can only imagine what it will be like when I walk by your side. I can only imagine what my eyes will see when your face is before me. I can only imagine. I can only imagine. Surrounded by your glory, what will my heart feel? Will I dance for you, Jesus? Or in awe of you be still? Will I stand in your presence? To my knees will I fall? Will I sing hallelujah? Will I be able to speak at all? I can only imagine. I can only imagine.